Okay, take two. Welcome to the Quadruple D. And today we're going to be talking about Dick Cheney, who is now deceased. We'll be discussing his legacy a little bit later on. And we're also going to talk about how little Marco loves bombing boats. So, in a secure meeting at the U.S. Capitol, Secretary of State Little Marco Rubio, as Donald Trump used to call him, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, aka the ultimate DUI hire, they briefed a bipartisan group of lawmakers for about an hour on the administration's mounting maritime operation to destroy vessels alleged to be smuggling drugs off the coast of South America. And the campaign has, according to administration figures, resulted in at least 66 people killed in 16 known strikes on boats in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific Ocean since early September 2025. So, pretty recently. These strikes were framed by the administration as part of an armed conflict. So, where's the other side that has the weapons? But anyway, it's an armed conflict, according to them, against drug trafficking networks and as a national security measure. So, if you think about it, this is really their ongoing effort to create new official enemies. And anytime they do that, they're likely going to call them, drug traffickers, gang members, maybe they're Antifa, just terrorists or something like that. They'll make up any number of claims to justify whatever it is that they want to do. And Republican members of Congress who were present reportedly either stayed silent or expressed support for the policy of Donald Trump, who has described the targeted vessels as carrying poisonous drugs that threaten American lives. So, imagine that narrative when key Republican point right now is to cut off food benefits, and they're trying to also cut off medical benefits for Americans. So you want to talk about threatening American lives? Well, that would be the US government right now under Donald Trump, who is scrapping all sorts of services to American taxpayers. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers criticize the briefing as insufficient and are demanding far more information, in particular about how the strikes are carried out, how targets are identified, and what legal authority underpins them. So think about that. That's like their main critique. It apparently isn't obvious enough that these are illegal deeds committed by the Trump administration. They just want a better rationale or justification for them. What underpins these decisions. Never mind that, if you're accused of crime, it's automatically assumed that there's going to be, a trial to find you guilty of said crime or something like that. But they're using the excuse that these are foreigners as just a justification to vaporize them. And the underlying message is also really a global one. It's that if this administration doesn't like you for whatever reason, they can just take you out. They can vaporize you on a whim. So it's a very powerful message intended to spread fear, not just among foreigners, the wicked foreigners out there, but also the wicked US citizens. And the disclosure came just before Congress was due to vote on a resolution that, if passed, would require congressional approval before any strikes directly on Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela. That's according to the Washington Post. According to experts monitoring the campaign and also according to common sense, the administration has disclosed only fragmentary details to Congress, with the bulk of information being limited to classified briefings and informal chats rather than full public transparency. the administration has taken the position that members of drug smuggling organizations are unlawful combatants who can be targeted like terrorists, even though these operations take place on the high seas and without a formal declaration of war. So, yet again, keep in mind that they want to be able to just label somebody a terrorist. You don't even need to prove that they committed any sort of terrorist act. Like, remember in the press meeting that Trump had with the president of El Salvador, that president had said, I'm not talking about Trump, that president of El Salvador, he claimed that the immigrant Kilmar Abrego Garcia was a terrorist. Keep that in mind. So there was no evidence whatsoever that Kilmar Abrego Garcia committed any sort of terrorist act. But he just threw the label around like it was confetti at a parade. And that's what they want to be able to do. And you don't need a formal declaration of war, you don't need any sort of legal process, just bomb somebody. And that really plays into what I say so much about right wing views on politics. Like, their solution to a given problem, or a perceived problem, is to bomb it, shoot it, stab it, beat it up, throw it in a prison cell, or deprive it of necessary resources, starve it. And that's whether it's a foreign perceived enemy or some domestic problem. That's that's their worldview, is just, you can't help people. You can't use resources to help people, but you can use them to harm people as much as you want. You can never spend enough money when it comes to destroying people. But when it comes to helping people, well, what can you do? You gotta really not look at that and in a humane way. You just have to say, sorry, we're gonna strip you of even more resources. We gotta make sure that that money is spent on war or something like that. So at the same time, the U.S. military and Navy have increased their deployment in the region off South America. Analysts have noted this naval buildup raises concerns of escalation, even of potential intervention, as they would call it, in Venezuela, and suggests the strikes may be part of a broader aim to apply pressure on the Maduro government. I don't know where Maduro came from. But anyway, we've got a bunch of troubling dynamics of state power being highlighted by all of this. The executive is expanding lethal military force beyond traditional war zones in the recent tradition of the past 20 something years. I'm sure you could also say it goes back further, and that would probably be true, but it's in some ways even more true now because it's just become so normalized that a lot of people don't even question it at this point. The use of lethal force, it's seen almost as a virtue unto itself, and they're redefining criminal activity, in this case drug trafficking, as a matter of armed conflict in order to bypass normal legal safeguards or anything like that. Congressional war powers oversight appears weakened when lethal force is used without full transparency or public accountability. The circular logic of labeling economic actors, in this case traffickers, as terrorists or combatants, reveals how states can transform non military threats into justification for military intervention. The deployment of military assets in the Caribbean and South America reveals how imperial state mechanisms, that's the Navy, missile strikes, remote intelligence, whatever, are used to project power abroad, undermining local autonomy and reinforcing the logic of external control rather than addressing root causes of trafficking like poverty, demand, corruption, etc. Without full disclosure of evidence, which analysts say is lacking, the strikes risk being arbitrary, violating international law. That's the law of naval interdiction, rights of the targeted persons, sovereignty of other states, and so on, and reinforcing the state's claim to kill without trial, presumably on a whim. In the legal debate, to the extent there even is one right now, fact checking sources note that while the administration claims the strikes are justified under Article 2 powers of the Constitution and the idea of self defense, many legal experts, and frankly, anyone with a brain, will caution that killing suspected criminal actors on the high seas without capture, due process, or clear treaty basis may be unlawful. Well, that's sort of a no duh sort of thing right there. Of course, it's unlawful. You can't just decide to, oh, I'm just going to murder somebody and, you know, just say that they're selling drugs or whatever or shipping drugs. Like, and for a second, I want you to think about the people you know who might have at one point used drugs or even sold drugs. You've probably met some people like that in your life. Do you think that, people who get caught up in, the drug business in one way or another, do you think they should necessarily just be outright murdered? I would say not. We have due process for even people like serial killers out there. So, when it comes to even the worst of the worst, there's supposed to be a legal process. That is what being a lawful country is all about. And it's this madness is, of course, coming from the so called party of law and order, as usual. They are some of the biggest criminals of all time. And the factual basis for some of the administration's claims appear weak. Well, not just some of the claims, I would say almost all of them. For example, the administration has claimed that certain boats carried large quantities of fentanyl, but the Drug Enforcement Administration and the U.S. State Department's reports show that fentanyl entering the U.S. is primarily smuggled overland from Mexico, not by sea from Venezuela or via boat. And you can read about that on factcheck.org if you want. And some analysts argue that Venezuela plays a minor role in the fentanyl trade, though it may serve as an occasional pathway for cocaine shipment. But of course, oddly enough, they're not even citing cocaine as a possibility because, fentanyl is really the trendy drug, at least in the MAGA mindset. So, ironically, if they would just use the word cocaine while talking about this, they might actually have more of a factual basis here. And that's not to say that people who are shipping cocaine necessarily should be bombed either. But I'm just saying it would probably be more accurate. So the briefing in question revealed some of the strategy for the boat strikes, but the key questions remain unanswered. The broader implications from erosion of congressional oversight to the extension of warlike powers into policing to the potential for escalation into state intervention deserve closer scrutiny. And fortunately, there are some moves in that direction. This briefing itself is part of that. But man, there's got to be so much more done. Uh, there should really be accountability here. The people in charge of directing these strikes, they should be facing criminal charges themselves, because if you're just in a random fishing boat and the Trump administration decides to vaporize you on a whim, I mean, wouldn't your family want the option to go after the people who took you out? So it's one of those things where you really have to put yourself in another person's shoes. And I know that empathy is lacking these days, but hey, it's a nice thing to have sometimes. It puts things into perspective. All right, so this week we're going to have a little bit of a longer episode than last week. I was a little bit rushed last time, so I'm going to look at the peripheral poop head of the week, and that is Mike Waltz. Yes, we are returning with the peripheral poop head of the week, even though obviously Mike Waltz does still have power. He is still relatively on the periphery because he's not exactly a media darling, and it's like he's got a bit of a lower profile, even though he still has power. So, in a major personnel shift on May 1st, 2025, Donald Trump announced that little Marco Rubio would assume the role of acting national security advisor while still serving as Secretary of State. This move effectively pushed aside Michael George Glenn Waltz, who stepped down on the same day. Waltz, born January 31st, 1974, in Boynton Beach, Florida, is a former U.S. Army Special Forces officer, businessman, author, and politician. So he's worn or wore plenty of hats, and he earned his BA in International Studies from the Virginia Military Institute and subsequently graduated Ranger School and the Special Forces Qualification Course. During his military career, active duty, and National Guard, he completed multiple combat tours in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Africa, and was awarded 4 Bronze Stars, including 2 for valor. So, wow, we're all supposed to be very impressed by that, but there are some elements that do not impress me about this guy, and I'm going to get into those. Politically, Waltz served as the U.S. representative for Florida's 6th congressional district from January 2019 till January 2025, when he resigned to join the White House in the second Trump administration, which was worse than the first. And in Congress, he was known as a hawk on China. He sat on the House China Task Force, sponsored legislation to reduce U.S. reliance on Chinese critical minerals, and argued that the Chinese Communist Party is effectively in a Cold War with the U.S. and the West. In November 2024, Trump announced that Waltz would serve as his national security advisor. Waltz assumed that post on January 20th, 2025. However, his time in the role was brief. On May 1st, 2025, Trump announced his replacement by Rubio and simultaneously nominated Waltz for U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. An incident in March 2025, which certainly grabbed some headlines, where Waltz inadvertently added Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic to a private Signal group chat of senior officials discussing a forthcoming U.S. military strike in Yemen, helped trigger the shakeup. So you might remember the Signal scandal, although in some ways the bigger scandal's not what they're telling you. If he wasn't a bit of a bonehead using unsecured messaging to coordinate operations, it wouldn't reveal how the state and its war apparatus evade robust public oversight otherwise. So, in a way, I think the scandal might actually be a good thing, accidentally anyway. This story, it really shows how individuals cycle through roles within the state security apparatus, military officer to congressman to national powerful advisor to diplomat, while the underlying system of violence, hierarchy, and imperial reach remain intact. And Waltz's shift to the UN post may look like a demotion or repositioning, but the continuity of his involvement in high-level global strategy, it shows how state power persists regardless of title. His combat record, his combat tours, special forces background, hawkish legislation, reflects how the modern liberal state marries political representation with military and intelligence infrastructures, making the boundary between civilian politics and martial command porous. Under this scenario, whether Waltz is in Congress or the UN or wherever, the apparatus of intervention, hierarchy, and global state violence remains operational, and that's really the main point. Doesn't so matter. It doesn't so much matter what his role is. The point is that he's got the violence going on because he craves that power so much. Just like so many of these people, they want to rule the world. They want to bomb fishing boats or whatever, have a cold war, have a hot war, whatever. Just they love conflict. They love the idea of dominating and the power to essentially choose the fate of the world. And the broader machinery of state power, military deployments, global diplomacy, intelligence operations continues largely without interruption. Well, unless boneheads accidentally expose the plans, or there are whistleblowers, or they overstep too much because their vision is too overtly authoritarian in scope, or whatever. So, all right, as promised, here is segment three, what I call the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And we are now looking at the recently deceased Dick Cheney. That's right, we're going to pick on a dead guy once again. So, Mike Waltz served in the Bush administration as a defense policy director in the Pentagon and as counterterrorism advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. So, oddly enough, he is relevant to the person I was just talking about. Birds of a feather flock together, as the saying goes. So, the biggest scandal involving Dick Cheney is arguably the Iraq War and the Halliburton conflict of interest, a nexus of corporate power, war profiteering, and political manipulation that defined early 21st century U.S. imperialism. So, let's look at that. And as I so often do on this podcast, on this show within a show, I'm going to view it sort of through an anarchic lens because to me it's interesting to look at how these extreme right wing people actually prove the anarchic critiques of power to be correct. So, the core scandal, of course, the background is that before becoming vice president, Cheney was CEO of Halliburton, one of the world's largest oil services and logistics corporations. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, Halliburton and its subsidiary KBR received billions of dollars in no bid contracts to rebuild infrastructure, manage logistics, and supply U.S. troops. So there was a conflict of interest. Cheney claimed he had divested from Halliburton, but he retained deferred compensation and stock options during his vice presidency. This created an obvious ethical breach. He was part of an administration making war policy that directly enriched his former corporation. And there was broader manipulation too, of course. The Bush Cheney administration pushed false intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, aka WMDs, to justify the war. They also falsely claimed that, the Saddam Hussein regime had a working relationship with Osama bin Laden, and they made similar claims. The CIA and the UN found no evidence of WMDs. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, destabilized the Middle East, and cost trillions. So, you want to talk about saving money, being a fiscal conservative? Well, that has never been the case. The scandal, if you were to say it in a sentence, Cheney used state power to funnel public money into private corporate hands under the cover of national security, a textbook example of war capitalism masquerading as democracy. So, from the silly Billy anarchic perspective, anarchism opposes both state authority and capitalist exploitation, seeing them as two sides of the same power structure. So, through that lens, Cheney's actions weren't a scandal in the sense of an exception, they were the system working exactly as designed. So, here's how an anarchic critique would read: you have state and capital as partners in crime. The Iraq War represents the fusion of state violence and corporate profit, the military industrial complex that the goofball anarchists like Emma Goldman and thinkers like Noam Chomsky have long condemned. The state wages war and capital harvest this will harvest the spoils. And of course there's a bit of an illusion of accountability too. Despite massive public opposition and documented lies, Cheney faced no real punishment, even though, of course, there was the fact that Bush and Cheney actually became unpopular, so that was the slight illusion of accountability. But there was no real legal consequences or anything like that. So it really illustrates an anarchic point. Law and democracy serve power, not justice, at least most of the time, a lot of the time. And elections change figureheads, not structures that much. And you've got violence as policy, of course. So, from an anarchic standpoint, the war exposed how violence isn't a breakdown of order, but the foundation of it. The state legitimizes killing when it's profitable or geopolitically convenient. And of course, you have the privatization of war, the rise of private military contractors and logistical firms like Halliburton illustrates, the anarcho capitalism idea in practice, not the utopian free market imagined by libertarians, but a real world fusion of monopoly, coercion, and state subsidy. That there is no actual freedom uh, when it comes to anarcho capitalism. The the capitalist aspect of it will always bolster state power and corruption and authoritarianism. So, the anarchic verdict on this topic: Cheney's scandal isn't that he corrupted the system, it's that he actually embodied it. So, the Iraq War shows how state power exists to protect capital, not people. Democratic accountability is a myth when the same elites rotate between government and corporations, and true opposition isn't about reform or punishment. It's about abolishing the institutions that make such corruption inevitable. Anyway, that's it for this episode. I think it was a solid commentary on what is going on right now and the legacy of somebody who actually even looked like a villain of some type. Dick Cheney. I mean, he even looked evil. Like he had that wicked smirk on his face half the time, and he just seemed grumpy and cantankerous. It it was not very hard to critique him based on that alone. But anyway, I think I will have another episode next week. I actually, you know, I don't know what I'll be talking about, but it should be interesting because unfortunately we do live in interesting times.